Well, good evening, everyone. You've not aged a bit.
Good start.
In fact, you're sitting in the very same place as you did last year about this time, which is why I know you haven't aged, because you haven't forgotten your place. You know exactly where you should be. Well, I'm honored and delighted to spend these next few Wednesday evenings with you, looking at which, for the next month at least, will be my favorite gospel, the Gospel of Mark. It was the Gospel of John, of course, when we were doing it. And let's see now. Betsy, how are you? Congratulations, you won the game last night. You have fans following you all over the world. You just didn't know. Anyway, good. Look with me to get ourselves underway. Back to John's Gospel, just for a moment. Hold your thumb there in the Gospel of Mark. Look at chapter 20 of John's Gospel, verse 30, because it becomes the launching pad for what we're going to be doing this evening and for the balance of our Wednesday night together. What John chapter 20, verse 30 says is this: Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. Well, guess what? Many of them are written in Mark. So with that in mind, we turn back to the Gospel of Mark. Aren't you excited to know we're going to be doing that? And tonight we're going to spend our time introducing this Gospel to you like I did with the Gospel of John. And you have, of course, in your hand a little outline, which is just mere skeleton, the bones upon which we will be hoping to put some meat while we're along the way. You already know what I'm about. Unit 1, by way of introduction to reading the Gospel of Mark or reading the Bible, there is a six-fold process through which I go, and I remind you again quickly about that. I won't say too much about that again. But before we ever read anything, all of us have a pre-text, that is background of various kinds and stripes that enable us to read and understand certain things in different ways. I used an illustration with you last year called simply the word plant. Remember? I gave you the word plant. And the moment you hear the word plant, people hear what? A variety of different things. So I thought tonight I'd give you another word to get us thinking so that when we read the Bible, we will begin to have some common ground for understanding. Here's the word. Are you ready for the word? Run. Are you in? The moment you hear the word run, you just saw something. Some of you saw something very interesting. What did you see, somebody? Somebody running a race. Very good. Well, I was just thinking about this, that if we had only scored one more run than the other team would have, we'd have won the city championship, but we didn't. We lost it because we didn't score enough runs. Now, that's two different things, isn't it? Run and run. But then I was also thinking that if I go out to the parking lot after our study this evening and I turn the switch on my truck and it doesn't start, I'm going to need somebody to run me to the gas station to get a little more gasoline to put into the tank to get me going again, won't I? And if things don't go well when I go to the gasoline station, when you run me down there, if I get out of the truck to go in to get a gas can to get some gasoline, and there's a large dog standing by the door there, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to run from that dog, and if my running from that dog doesn't go well, when I get home, I'm going to have to drop my clothes into the washing machine, and if I happen to mix them in with some red towels, something's going to what? Run all over my clothes. Now, see, that's just one word, run, isn't it? And yet about that one word run, we've already given what? 4, 5, 6 different definitions or meanings. Such is the case when we read the Bible. Often enough, we hear a word, and when we hear the word, all kinds of things flash into our personalities, our minds, and our brains. And the word that I want to give you now, that is relative to the Gospel of Mark, is the word disciple. Disciple as in one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Because the Gospel of Mark, among all of the Gospels, really is a gospel about discipleship. I don't know if you read the Gospel of Mark lately, and I don't know if in your reading it you have read it alongside the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke perhaps, not so much John, but certainly Matthew and Luke. If you read the Gospel of Mark alongside the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, you will see something quite peculiar. You will discover rather quickly in the Gospel of Mark, brace yourselves, and I'm not being disrespectful to the Gospel, I'm simply being true to it. The disciples in the Gospel of Mark, they bumble and they stumble along. They are not very bright. In fact, they're quite obtuse. They miss the most obvious things. They're quite the characters. Now you read the other Gospels and the disciples actually come off quite exemplary. They're wonderful models for us to follow. But when you read the Gospel of Mark, the disciples aren't such stellar models. So ask yourself the question that I'm asking myself. So which is it? Are the disciples of Jesus really good examples? Or are they sometimes stumbling, bumbling along and not so bright? Well, I'm glad you asked. Yes. Because in this very room and standing before you are disciples. And sometimes, you know what? We are exemplary followers of Jesus Christ. But just wait till tomorrow. And we will what? We will bumble along, we will stumble along, and we won't be necessarily stellar examples for the world to see. Such is the nature of being a disciple. The Gospel of Mark is a journey about discipleship. Now I'm jumping ahead a bit in the outline down to Unit 2, down to number 5 under letter D. So Roman 1, letter D, 5. It says the 12 disciples as foils. Now some of you might remember from your days back in literary criticism when you were doing your English classes. Do you remember what a foil is, literarily speaking? A foil is a negative example. And guess what? The Gospel of Mark, inspired as it is by our Lord, when Mark wrote this Gospel, the disciples served as foils, so that when you hear the disciples say something, and it sounds like they're really locked in and they really are getting it right in the Gospel of Mark, you know what you do? You go, that's not it. By the same token, when they do other things, always think just the opposite, and guess what? You'll get it right. Unless you think I'm making this up. Midway of the Gospel, chapter 8, about dead center of the book. Jesus is going to ask a question of the disciples. Who do you say that I am? And old Peter is going to stand forward among all the people, among the disciples, and he's going to say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus, do you know what he's going to say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. What? Now, Peter gets it right, but Peter gets it what? Gets it wrong, because his definition of what the Messiah is supposed to be and Jesus' definition, guess what? They're not the same. And if you can possibly wait a couple of weeks, we'll get to chapter 8. Just setting you up. Gospel of Mark. Now, pretext. All of us have them. When you hear us making reference to the disciples, or when you hear the Gospel of Mark describing the way disciples function in the book, if they don't come off so swimmingly, don't panic. It's quite by design. It is exactly the way in which the Lord has chosen to inspire this particular gospel you read. Okay? Now, with that in mind, who is the author of this particular gospel? Well, its title is who? Mark. We know about a Mark elsewhere in the biblical story, don't we? He had a first name, John Mark. You remember him. John Mark didn't come off so well in the biblical story, did he? Because he ends up, having traveled with Paul and Barnabas for a bit, and then he goes home. I think he had girl problems. I don't know. Anyway, we don't know. He had to go home to sort out some family business or whatever it was, and so Paul dismisses him and he doesn't come off so well. Is this the same Mark? We don't know. Did many people in the biblical time in which this gospel was written have the name Mark? Yes. We don't know which particular Mark this happens to be, so there's no need for us to exhaust ourselves trying to figure that one out because we don't know. We just don't know. That was easy enough. Place. To which place was it that this particular gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written? Well, according to the tradition, and for the most part the tradition seems to give us a good place to start, the Christian community of the congregation, the church, to which the Gospel of Mark was originally written, would have been to the church at Rome. Okay? The Roman Christians who lived there, according to the tradition, that's the place. So there's a group of Christians in Rome, and were these Christian Jews or were they Gentiles? Well, they were a mixed bag, but for the most part, the Christians in the congregation at Rome, they were former pagans, they were Gentiles. We know these things indirectly from within the Gospel of Mark itself, because this may surprise you for those of you who know a little bit of Latin. There are right many Latinisms in the Gospel of Mark, even in the Greek text. Now, why would that be of interest to us? Latinisms. Who spoke Latin in Jesus' day? The Romans, precisely. Greek, of course, was the dominant language because Alexander the Great introduced that language, which is the language in which the New Testament is written. It was still the common language of the day, but the Romans, with Julius Caesar, 41, 42 BC, had just begun to come into their heyday, and they were the dominant power in the New Testament world. And there are right many Latinisms in the Gospel of Mark, which gives us some signals, doesn't it? And Mark will explain certain of the Jewish customs and traditions to the congregation. Undoubtedly, they didn't know them because they weren't Jewish. They were more what? They were more Gentiles and more pagan. So we know who they are. So that's important. I'm looking back now to the time in which the Gospel was written. Most people know, and rightly so, that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the Gospels written. Most people know that. Earlier than the Gospel of John. The Gospel of Mark was written most likely in the mid-60s. In the mid-60s, not 1960, but in the mid-60s. Sometime, some 4 or 5 years, or running up to the great war that ended the city of Jerusalem and basically wiped the nation Israel off the map at the time. Okay? Most know that's when it would have been written. Which means that he's anticipating the drums of war are beginning to sound in the story, wondering what's going to happen to Jerusalem. We'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 13. That, by the way, is called the Little Apocalypse. It's all about the last things. It's all about second coming and such things. I bet you won't miss that night, will you? Chapter 13. We'll be looking at that text with some interest when we get there in the Little Apocalypse. That's chapter 13 of the Gospel of Mark. This particular Gospel does several things stylistically that I want to point out to you quickly when we get us into the text. You see under style, Isaiah. Isaiah is the most quoted biblical reference in the Gospel of Mark. Isaiah is Mark's preferred go-to prophet or biblical voice. He's all over the place. The word Isaiah, by the way, means Yahweh or God saves. Interesting. So Isaiah is very important. Secondly, in the Gospel of Mark, geography is very important. You will watch with great interest, as I will point out to you and remind you along the way, on which side of the Sea of Galilee, called the Lake Gennesaret, on which side of the lake is it that Jesus does the things that he does? Will you be surprised to learn that Jesus will feed the multitude 2 times? He will feed the multitude once on one side of the lake, and then he will go to the other side of the lake and feed the multitude over there. What's up with that? Well, that's a great question. Jesus will constantly be going back and forth across the lake because the Gospel of Mark, as it tells the Jesus story, is fully aware that one side of the lake is the Jewish side of the lake, and the other side of the lake, guess what? It's the Gentile side of the lake. Okay? We've got the North Carolina, South Carolina divide. We've got the Clemson, South Carolina divide. And you don't go to the other side of the track. Or when you do, you can expect what? You can expect things are going to be interesting when you do. But Jesus, amazingly, will cross rather freely back and forth across the lake from the Jewish side to the Gentile side. And you and I can only thank God that he did in fact choose to cross from the Jewish side to the Gentile side. Why would I say such a thing? Because you and I, or most of us in this room, are what? We are Gentiles. And the best story of all in the Gospel of Mark is everything he does on the Jewish side, what? He does it on the Gentile side too. Whew. Aren't we glad? Aren't we lucky and aren't we fortunate that he wisely saw that even in his own day? So, pay attention to the geography. On which side of the lake is it that Jesus is when he does what he does? There's a third thing in here called messianic secrecy. Strikingly in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus will do this amazing miracle for a person, and when he does this amazing miracle for this person, the first thing he will say to that person is, now don't you breathe a word of this to anybody. Do what? If you and I have what? Something miraculous done to us, we're going to what? In fact, Philip is going to require of you to come forward during the invitation time on Sunday morning and tell the whole world that what? This is what Jesus has done for me. But Jesus does amazing things for people, and he says, and don't you say a word to anyone. You know why? Because he knows that people are going to be confused by what he does, and they will assume about him the wrong thing. And we will watch with much interest the wrong assumptions that they will have, even our disciples. There is a fourth thing of interest here by way of introduction. You see it, letter 4. Is called an intercalation. Somebody from the seminary had to come up with that word. An intercalation. So that you can say that you've been studying with someone with a PhD. That's your word. Intercalation. For the rest of us, it's a sandwich. Okay? Now you know what a sandwich is, don't you? A sandwich has what? 2 slices of bread on the outside and what? Meat in the middle. Well, guess what the Gospel of Mark does? The way in which it chooses to tell the Jesus story is, it begins a story and interrupts the story that it has just begun with another story, and then circles around and finishes the story that it began. That's an interesting communication device. It's quite old. It reaches all the way back to the Odyssey and Odysseus. Who remembers the Odyssey and Odysseus? Were you absent from school that day? You remember this? The Odyssey and Odysseus. Well, as that story begins, Odysseus is returning from his Odyssey. That's how the story begins. He's returning from the Odyssey. All of those things have happened to him. And he's bearded now, and he's unkempt, and he returns home. And he enters the gate of the property, and he's making his way to the house, and his servant, who from some 20, 30 years earlier was there at his side, meets him but does not recognize him. But the dog does. And when Odysseus sits down, and his servant makes him sit down as this stranger coming to the gate, he begins to wash Odysseus' feet. And when he does, he spots a scar on Odysseus' ankle. And he recalls the story when Odysseus was a young man out boar hunting with him, and he cut his foot. And then Homer tells the whole story of the Odyssey. So you see what happens? The story begins, it's interrupted by another story, and then it concludes the story. It's a well-known literary device, and the Gospel of Mark does that. Sometimes we preachers, when I preach, I love to do that. I love to begin telling you a story, and then interrupt that story, so that you're hanging around with me for the rest of the sermon, so you can find out what happened at the end of the story. When I was first preaching at First Baptist Shelby, which was a televised ministry there for the local people, I would begin a story, and sometimes the service would run late, and they'd cut off the worship service at 12 noon. I'd have people stop me on the street and say, well, what happened to? And I'd say, what are you talking about? Well, you know in that story. I said, what do you mean? You weren't at church? Well, no, but I was watching. Well, anyway. So this is the way the Gospel of Mark, this is the way it works. Begins with a story, interrupts the story with another story, and then concludes the story. In fact, this is such a good thing. Let me just jump ahead and show you this. Are you ready to go there? Chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 21. It's such a powerful story. You don't want to miss it. Chapter 5, verse 21. And, in fact, it does a lot of things. Watch it. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side. Aha. Where? The other side. So you got to know what? On what side of the lake he had been to know to which side of the lake he's returned. A great crowd gathered about him. He was beside the sea. 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. Well, you already know what side of the lake we're on now. He's on the Jewish side, because we have a what? A ruler of the synagogue. Okay? Jairus by name. And seeing him, this being Jairus, Jairus fell at his feet. 23. And begged him, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. 24. And he went with them, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. 25. And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. Now look what just happened. Interrupted. Jairus has come to get Jesus. His daughter is at the point of death. They're on their way to Jairus' home when what? Jesus gets interrupted. I don't know about you, but if I'm Jairus, I'm saying, hold on, dude. I got to him first. He's going what? He's going with me. Maybe he'll have time to come back and see you, but I got to him first. But that isn't what happens. There is a woman who has an issue of blood, which she has had for what? For 12 years. Knowing, as you will know, about Jewish tradition and about blood, she is therefore and thereby unclean. Even in her own household, she is unclean. Wherever she sits, no one else can sit. No one can have any contact with her. She is a social what? Outcast in every way. And here she is, as verse 26 tells us, having suffered much under many physicians. In other words, no medical doctor could provide anything that would be of benefit or help to her. And had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather only grew worse. 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus. I don't know, so you're into the story now. Now we're all wrapped into this woman on it. Forgotten about Jairus and his got a little sick daughter. So, which one is more valuable here in the story? Well, yes, both of them are what? They're equally valuable, but notice how strategically as the story unfolds, as Jesus' ministry goes, what happens? Someone interrupts someone else. Now let me go ahead and cut to the chase on this so far. This is our life, isn't it? Interruptions. How many of you had a plan one day? You knew exactly where you were headed and exactly where you were going, and what? Something interrupted you. And some people I know will spend their lives looking back, saying, if only what? If only this thing had not happened. I mean, how many of you are old enough to have been drafted? That's in the news these days. Drafted to war. That what? That changed your life, didn't it? You weren't planning for that. It what? It interrupted your life. How many of you had other plans that, well, you can name it? This is the story of our lives. That we have our plans, and something will what? Will interrupt our lives. And some people will spend the rest of their lives looking back saying, if only this interruption had not happened, I what? I might have been something other than I am. Well, the truth is, the interruption is our life. Now, what are we going to do with what? With whatever it is that happens that interrupts our lives. And aren't we glad that sometimes, somehow, some way in our story, the interruption did happen that allowed us and enabled us and put us in the place where we are? Yes, we are. Well, she had heard these reports about Jesus, verse 27, came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I shall be made well. And immediately, we're told, and by the way, immediately, your homework assignment between now and next week is to sit down if you can and read the Gospel of Mark from start to finish in a single sitting if you can. Just read it. It's only 16 chapters, 9 verses. It's the shortest of the Gospels. You can easily accomplish this. And take a pencil and watch how many times the word immediately shows up. It is one of Mark's favorite words. Immediately, some English translations will occasionally call it suddenly, but it's the same Greek word every time. Yes.
Straightway.
Straightway sometimes. Immediately, everything is boom, boom, immediately, suddenly. So suddenly or immediately, verse 29, we're told, the hemorrhage stopped. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now, to appreciate what has happened to her and what she has done, you have to reach back to an Old Testament story, in fact, two of them. One of them concerns Saul of the Old Testament and the prophet Samuel. You remember the relationship between Saul and Samuel. So Samuel is the prophet and Samuel anoints the kings. Saul, of course, started out well enough but ended up not so well, as we know the story. He and the prophet Samuel have an encounter once when Saul is starting to stray from the path that he should have been on. And in the scene being described, Saul is in his kingly apparel, wearing, as he would, his prayer shawl. And every prayer shawl, have you seen a Jewish prayer shawl? Every prayer shawl has on one of its corners, on the kaldaf of the corner, a tzitzit it's called, which is a little spiraled blue cord, which is associated with the authority of the one, the father of the household, wearing the prayer shawl. It reaches all the way back to the kings of Israel. And this woman knows if she can just what? Just touch the hem, as we call it, the authority of Jesus' prayer shawl, she can be well. This same corner of this shawl shows up at another time in the Samuel, Saul, David story. So when Saul is having this encounter by Samuel, Samuel reaches and grabs the corner of that tassel on that prayer shawl and rips it off and says to Saul, God is taking your what? Your authority, your kingdom away from you and giving it to somebody else. Some short time thereafter, David is hiding in a cave in En Gedi. And of all the caves in En Gedi and all the caves around the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea where he could have hidden, Saul is trying to find him and trying to kill him. And Saul, as the text tells us in the Samuel text, goes to relieve himself in a certain cool cave at En Gedi. Lo and behold, David's hiding in the back of that cave. And when Saul spreads out his shawl over himself to do his business, David creeps up and cuts off with his sharp knife the corner of Saul's authority. And Saul makes his way out, and David steps out from hiding and says, Saul, oh Saul, and he's dangling that right there, saying to him, if I wanted to have killed you, I could easily have done so, but it is the Lord who has placed you in power, and it will be the Lord who will remove you from power. But I have your what? I have your number. Now, that's all backstory to this woman just knowing if I what? If I can just touch that, it's going to make all the difference in my life. And Jesus, verse 30 tells us, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And the disciples, our brilliant, wonderful disciples, said to him, you see this crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter. Now, didn't the story begin with that word? Daughter. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now, how long did she have that disease? 11 years. I thought you knew that. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? 36. But ignoring what he said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. 37. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. Now who did he let follow? Peter, James, and John, the big three. Not because they're what? Not because they're special, not because they're more inspired, but because they're really slow. They have to what? They need special attention to get this right. All right? When they came to the house, verse 38, of the ruler of the synagogue, saw the commotion, people weeping, wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you in such an uproar and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. They laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi. Now this is an Aramaic expression, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. But that isn't really what it means. Talitha. You see the word Talitha? Talitha is a Semitic expression. It is in Aramaic, and it has as its origin the word talith. Do you know what a talith is? A talith is that little spiraled cord on the end of the prayer shawl. In other words, this little girl is wrapped in her father's prayer shawl. And Jesus says, you who is wrapped in the talith, rise up. Now, do you see the connection? The connection between the woman who says, if I can just what? If I can just touch the talith. So the ruler of the synagogue has a talith that he believes if what? Daughter is wrapped in the talith, she's going to get well. But he knows he's powerless, that her condition has only worsened, not improved. Jesus comes in and says, you who what? Who are wrapped in your father's talith, prayer shawl, I say to you, rise. And immediately the girl got up and walked. And do you see the parenthetical now? She was what? 12 years old. As long as she has been alive, another woman in the story has been dead. What do I mean by that? How long had the woman had the issue of blood? 12 years. As long as one had been living, another one had been dead. And Jesus, in his wisdom, knows that he can what? He can address both of these situations. Point being, let's leave the timing of the stuff that happens in our lives to God. Now, you know us. I'm there. I'm Jairus. It's my little girl that's sick. I'm clearing all the disciples out. And Jesus is what? He's going with me now. But he knows better, does Jesus, how his timing should play out in everyone's life, not just what? Not just my private life. In this case, both 12-year what? Illnesses have been what? Have been remedied and cured. Jesus understands how to do this. And as we're reading the text, it says, latter part of verse 42, they were immediately overcome with amazement. Verse 43, and he strictly charged them to run out and tell everybody. Oh no. He strictly charged them that what? No one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now, why is it that he doesn't want anyone to know this? It will become clearer as we back up and look at the balance of the gospel. And it all has to do with theology, which is letter B under number 1 of Unit 2. The theology of the Gospel of Mark is all about rightly understanding who Jesus is. Who is Jesus? What has he come to do? What is he about? Should we expect always that Jesus is going to do a miracle for any and everyone? No. He does it sometimes. He can do it anytime. But often enough he may choose what? Not to do it. And he certainly chose not to do it on his own behalf. Because this gospel is going to tell us that Jesus is headed to Jerusalem. And what's going to happen when he gets there? They are going to what? They're going to reject him. They're going to beat him. They're going to crucify him. That's where he's going. And he will become the Messiah of the world. Not by what? Not by gathering a troop of army, soldiers, or disciples. I mean, our disciples are going to ask Jesus at some point in this gospel, Jesus, when you get to Jerusalem, James and John, when we get to Jerusalem, let me be on your left hand, general. Let me be on your right hand as general. They will ask Jesus. And Jesus will say, guys, you got it all wrong. This is not the kind of kingdom I have come to establish. Jesus has a different plan for how he will be victorious in this world. And it will happen where? On a cross. That's how he will win the victory. That's the book of Revelation, which we'll do next year. Well, anyway, coming back. We're coming back. Anyway, so here's how this gospel is going to work. Is this going to be a fun story? Yes, it's going to be an amazing story. So now we look to the organization of the gospel by turning back to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. We could just pick it up and go from chapter 5, but let's back up and catch it at the beginning. So here is how the gospel begins. Your text you have in front of you will say something probably like the beginning of the good news or the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Is that basically what you're saying? It's an interesting way in which to begin a book. The beginning, which means the way in which this story begins is a lot like the way in which another biblical story begins. I'm thinking way back yonder to Genesis. In the beginning. The reason this particular gospel begins this way, it is to say, look, the God whom you're going to meet in this gospel is, guess what? It's the same one. Except this one is going to be called, this is the Son of God. Now, how does he become the Son of God? It's fascinating, it's interesting. The Gospel of Mark does not begin with a story of Jesus' birth. We get Jesus' birth in Matthew, we get Jesus' birth in Luke, but guess what? The Gospel of Mark is going to begin the story of the good news of Jesus Christ with his baptism. Now that is not coincidental. It is not by mistake. It isn't that Mark doesn't know about Jesus' birth. It isn't it at all. It rather is because this is a gospel about discipleship. And you know where discipleship begins? Not when you're born, when you're baptized. Are you tracking me? Discipleship does not begin for any one of us at our births. Discipleship begins for Christians for when we do what? When we believe in Jesus Christ, and the affirmation or testimony of our belief in Jesus Christ is when we what? When we enter the waters of baptism. That's the sign that points in that direction and moves us forward. So this gospel is going to proceed along that pathway, emphasizing that even for Jesus, his ministry, his public ministry at age 30, begins with his what? With his baptism. So, let's look at the baptism. Verse 9, chapter 1. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, what's the word? Immediately. I mean, that's 6 times already in just inside of two chapters. Immediately, he saw the heavens split open and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. Now, it doesn't say a bird landed on Jesus' shoulder. It said the Spirit what? Like a dove. Something visible happened. 11. And a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." Now, I hope you hear the impact of that. God offers his affirmation and confirmation of his Son when his Son is what? Baptized. I hope you hear in this the power of what happens when any person enters the waters of baptism. When you enter the waters of baptism and profess your faith through such a powerful symbol, did you hear God say it? You are my beloved child. I mean, we are Baptists, for heaven's sakes, aren't we? Where did we get that crazy name from? We happen to believe that what? Baptism means something, doesn't it? I know, I'm not getting all sacramental on you here. But I am here to tell you that what? When baptism happens, it's something. It's special. It's amazing. And if ever there is a moment in church when the congregation ought to stand and applaud, hey, hear me, what? It's not when she or he sings well. Sorry, Lee. But I mean, it ought to be when? When somebody is baptized, because that's when God says what? I could not be more pleased with you ever than when what happened? Than when you did this. This is special. And this is what we have in solidarity with Jesus. The same way when Jesus' ministry and life was launched with his baptism, guess what? Your life and ministry is launched with your baptism. But you're not surprised, are you, that no sooner has this happened, verse 12, that the Spirit immediately drove him out into the what?
Wilderness.
Into the desert wilderness. And he was out there 40 days. So I got good news and bad news. The good news is, when you were baptized, God and the angels broke into celebration and said, wow, you can't get it any better than that. What's the bad news? The rest of your life, you're in the wilderness. Do you hear me? The rest of your life, you and I are in the wilderness. And guess what? Somebody's out there in the wilderness. And he's none too happy that you have what? Left one life and have entered another life. And he aims to do his dead level best to what? Make your life as difficult as it can be. Newsflash, he's good at it. Really good at it. Knows your and my every weakness, so much so to stray over into Paul's book of Ephesians. You can't deal with him short of putting on the what? The full armor. Show up with less than that, this one will kick your fanny. He's been at it what? A very, very long time. And if you've lived very long, you know what? You know how good it is. And if you're very self-aware at all, you know what? You know what you're capable of. He's out there in the wilderness. We're out there in the wilderness 40 days. This word 40, does it ever show up any other time in the Bible? Oh, yes. 40 is a powerfully symbolic number. It's a generation, which is your life and mine. There he is out there. Fortunately, he's out there, we're told, with the wild beasts. It's rough out there. And angels minister to it. So we have some assistance when we're out there. But we have to call upon that assistance and that help. I'm not getting into the story of angels here, but I'm just here to tell you, you become a Christian, your life is going to be tough. What more feeling? You become a Christian, your life and my life is going to be tough. It isn't going to be easy street. Lest you don't understand this, verse 14 tells us, after John was arrested. Oh, you mean John got arrested? Why so? Because he believed in Jesus, and his life was what? His life was hard too. After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel, the good news of God, and saying, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe in the gospel. Now there's a good church word. Repent. When's the last time you did? I'm not asking you to stand up and make a confession, but you need to make one in your own spirit, as do I. Because you know what happens. We look at this culture in which we live, and it's pretty bad out there. We get to feeling pretty what? Pretty self-righteous and pretty holy. But the kingdom of God is all about being aware that what? While we aren't what we once were, we are not yet what we're going to be, and a significant piece of this, a word that is strangely absent from most of our vocabularies, is the word what? Yes, you don't even want to say it, do you? Go ahead. What are we feeling? Repent. Lord, and what is this repentance stuff? I mean, this is like owning our what? It's owning our stuff and saying, God, I've messed it up. And I'm what? I mean, I'm deeply sorry and troubled by what I am. And I need what? I need good news to what? Wash away this mess that I still make of my life and other people's lives. Repentance is serious business. I mean, when's the last time, Philip, when you preached it? You said, okay, folks, this is Repentance Sunday. And everybody piled out of their pews and came forward and knelt and prayed for forgiveness. I mean, you see, it's not a common word. I mean, our word these days is, it's not my fault. I can't help it. I was born this way. My parents gave me these miserable genes that I have, and I do these things. You know, just go sit in the trial. Go sit in the courtroom sometime. There's nobody guilty there. Somebody else is to blame for whatever. No, this book is about being honest about what? Okay, half of you are not coming back next week. I got you. All right. One of these old-timey preachers up there this time. Okay, all right. Okay. Anyway, watch what happens now. Here's the rest of the beginning of our story. Passing along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea. They were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I'll make you to become fishers of men." Now, bear in mind that these persons, these fishermen, Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, they have not seen Jesus do what? One thing. They were not there when the voice came from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son." They haven't seen anything. And this fella, named Jesus, whom they've never seen, walks up to them at their job and says, "Leave your job and come with me." Now, you'd all get up and follow him, wouldn't you? You nor I, no. But watch what they do. Immediately, verse 18, they left their nets and followed him. Now, the fascinating part about this is, you nor I, we never know whether the person to whom we say, and I do hope you say this to people. We're having a study where I'm doing an intro right now on a really novel term called evangelism. Evangelism. That is, how do you share the gospel with you? Now, this is the simple point here. Just like these fellows here to whom Jesus said these words, them never having seen Jesus do anything. It's not like Jesus whipped up a miracle right in front of them and said, "Look, if you follow me, this is the cool stuff you're going to see me do." Oh, no. He just said, "Hey, guys, come follow me." You never know whether the person who you are going to say what you're going to say to when you see them is ready to do what? Follow Jesus. I was never more shocked by this than when one summer I asked the question of a summer missionary who was working with us how it was she, from Syracuse, New York, came to be a Christian. She said, "I was just walking in the park in Syracuse, New York, where I grew up, and a group of Baptists, who we didn't know anything about in New York at the time, were having a vacation Bible school, whatever that is. And they started talking about Jesus, and I knew immediately that he should be my Savior." First time she ever heard it. Just like that. She was just that ready. Point being, you nor I, we don't know, do we? But we are called to do what? Just say to people, "What, hey, how are you? What's going on with your relationship with God?" It's not a hard sale. And if they say not much, or they may say, well, so the opportunity will be there is the point. Going a little farther, verse 19, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat, mending their nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father, Zebedee, in the boat with the hired servants, and they followed him. Amazing. 21. We'll go to church now. "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately, on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught." 22. "And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes." 23. "And immediately," my goodness, does he like his word? "And immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit." Do you mean to tell me there are people in the synagogue? In the church? Well, not many, but do you mean to tell me there are people in the church with unclean spirits? And, verse 24, He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" Translation. New preacher? What do you mean coming in here with these strange ideas? Have you come to change the way we do things here? Have you come to change the way we do things here? I mean, aren't those the words, the most dreaded words in church? We don't do it that way here. We've never done it that way here. We're not going to do it that way here. He gets the rest of it right. I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. I mean, he's spot on right. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent." Now, that's what the translators do with this one. Be silent and come out of it. It's literally, shut up and come out. Oh, and by the way, we will read these very same words in chapter 4. There's going to be a storm raging on the sea. They're going to wake Jesus up. He's going to come topside of the boat. And the English translations are going to say, "Peace be still." I don't know what Greek text they're failing to read here, but guess what Jesus says? "Shut up." And suddenly the blood. That howling animal of a storm just chills out. So he tells this man, "Shut up and come out of it." 26, and the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him, and they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, "What is this? A new teaching? With authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Now notice the authority. So the voice says to Jesus, "I'm well pleased with you." And he starts calling people, and with the authority that he has, what happens? People get up and follow him. He comes to the synagogue, and the people acknowledge his what? His authority over what? Over an unclean spirit. So first he has authority over people's lives and occupations and jobs and calls them and they follow him. Now he what? Has authority over unclean spirits. We will watch with much interest how Jesus will summarily have authority over every realm imaginable. The next story, by the way, is about a woman who has a sickness. She's got a fever. Reckon Jesus is going to have some authority on that matter? Well, let's look and see quickly. Immediately, there's that word again, he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew and James and John. Now, by the way, should you happen to go to Israel with us, and you ought to go with us, May 11 to 2020, we're going to go back. In the city of Capernaum, among the reconstruction of the city that has happened, there is a synagogue that sits not 100 yards, more like 50 yards, from the synagogue to the house that has rightly been identified as the home of Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Jesus leaves the synagogue and does what? Immediately leaves the synagogue and enters the house. He just walks a short distance, and there it is. It'll give you chills when you're there. This scene happened there. You walk right down here. Here's Simon Peter's mother-in-law's house. Verse 30. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. And immediately, there it is again, they told of her. 31. He came and took her by the hand, lifted her up, the fever left, and she what? She served them. Would you be intrigued to know what the Greek word here is? She diakoniaed them. The first deacon. She deaconed them. Now, the word deacon means what? Minister to, serve. She's the first one. The first one who what? Who serves, who ministers to the group there. In return for what Jesus has done for her, she what? She ministers. She deacons. That evening, verse 32, at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick and possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door, and he healed many of them who were sick with various diseases, cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So he hushed them. But then watch what he does to end our study tonight. In the morning, a great while before day, he rose and went out into the desert. Now, look. If you have managed to do what Jesus has done thus far, he's drawn a great crowd of people. And having drawn a great crowd of people, Jesus now says what? I got to get out of here. So, next Sunday, if the church is running over with people, Philip, and Philip says, I got to leave, I got to get out of here. You're going to say, whoa, you all are going to say, no, wait, whoa. We what? How do we operate? We think an indication of where God is most actively at work is when what? When we got the numbers. Look how many more we... Now, nothing wrong with numbers, nothing wrong with people. But don't ever confuse the numbers as necessarily an indication that what? God's all about this. Because Jesus gets up and says, I got to get out of here. And Simon, verse 36, and those who were with him pursued him. 37. They found him and said, everybody's searching for you. Jesus, we got the crowd. Come on back. We've got the crowd here. And he said to them, verse 38, let's go on to the next town. Let's go on to the next town, that I may preach there also. This is why I came out. I left what? This crowd, who think that all I'm about is what? Healing this and that and the other, when in reality there's something else the people need. Now this isn't complicated. Any one of us can be healed from any sickness or disease that we've ever had. And that will last for a while. There'll be something else to what? To take its place. But there is something else that we can receive from our Heavenly Father through the power of His Holy Spirit, through Jesus Christ's gift, that can be taken from us. And that's His what? That's His word of forgiveness of our sins that changes our lives. Jesus wants to get out of there where He can go and speak that truth to other people. And He went throughout all Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out the evil. And the leper came to Him. So you see how this thing is ratcheting up? Leprosy? You think Jesus can deal with a leper? You think He can handle leprosy? I said we would stop, but I guess we're not. Came to Him and kneeling said to Him, if you will, you can make me clean. Verse 41. The translations do interesting things with this word. Moved with what? Pity, compassion. That's it? Just pity and compassion? No little notes anywhere in your text?
Anger.
Ah, what?
Anger.
Yeah, move with anger. Now, what's up with that? Move with pity or compassion or anger. The Greek word here is orge. That's the word for wrath or anger. Jesus is angry at what? Leprosy. He is moved with anger at what? This that has happened to this man. Can he be angry at those things? You better hope he can be. He's out to do what to it? To rid it. So moved with anger, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be what? Be clean. Immediately, there's that word again, 42, the leprosy left him and he was made clean. 43, and he sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said, see that you what? Say nothing to anybody. Now wait a minute, Jesus. You have just cured me of an incurable disease. And I'm not supposed to even say that you did? You see how we would tend to think? But Jesus knows better why we should do what we do than we know ourselves. Let's be honest about that. There are right many things in our lives that left to our own what? Our own design, we will do this, not knowing what? The implications of it. So we ought to learn, as we become increasingly better and better disciples, to listen to and trust who? Jesus. Do what he says. I wish I could say that I always have, but I haven't. And when I haven't, guess what? It's always disastrous. It may seem in the moment like what? This is a good thing. But Jesus knows better. Listen to what he says. Don't say this to anybody. But rather, go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses prescribed to the people. 45. But he went out and what? Began to proclaim about it and to spread the word. Watch the result. So that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. So do you see? The man's enthusiasm to what? Celebrate how good this was for him. It ended up costing what? Other people the opportunity to hear. See how Jesus knows better what we should be doing than we know ourselves? So he had to go out into the country and people came to him from every quarter. Well, you don't get to be quiet about this. You have to go out and tell everybody what the Lord has done for you, because He's done amazing things for us. And people need to know this from us. And you will have opportunity, as will I, to share this good news with people that we meet everywhere and to allow God to do something for them that only he can do. And you never know whether they're going to be just right ready to make a positive decision. So Lord, in our going tonight, we thank you for walking with us in our coming, and for teaching us from this amazing gospel how best we can serve you by repenting, owning those things about our lives that need to be changed, and then by moving us forward to share this amazing good news with other people. And how we thank you for the Gospel of Mark and those disciples who often got it wrong, who teach us how to get it right. Thank you for this church, for these good friends who gather in this place, for the good food that we've eaten, and everything that's happened this night. And we will give you praise and honor in the good name of Jesus. And all God's people said? Amen. Amen. Good night. I don't know who's calling.